stores to luxury boxes, street corners to grand salons. It's a product worth $110 billion a year, whose key commodity is grown by some of the poorest people on the planet, in plantations that can hide the worst forms of child labour. This is a story of cocoa to chocolate, bean to bar, poverty to profit. With unprecedented access to one of the industry's most influential figures.
Do whatever you want, go do your job, show whatever you have to show, and I'm going to do my job. That's all.
It's early October, cocoa season across the southern half of the Ivory Coast. The cocoa pods are ripe for picking. This is a journey along the supply chain of chocolate, from the pods on the trees to the cocoa beans in the market and the chocolate in the shop. Only by understanding the relationship between all can we hope to unravel the complexity of poverty and child labour. Here, it's a critical time of the year for these poor rural communities, and for chocolate lovers too, because this small equatorial country in West Africa produces nearly 40% of the world's cocoa. And these are the cocoa beans, the beginnings of chocolate. What's the name of this gooey stuff that's around it?
They call it mistilage. This is in Spanish they call it la baba, which is what you get out of your mouth.
Each pod contains 30 to 40 beans, enough to make about 10 Kit Kats, one of Nestlé's top-selling bars. They are smashed open with machetes, the basic tool of the bush. It's low-tech and labour-intensive. And unfortunately, in this part of Africa, it really is a case of many little hands make work. And it's not light. According to the US government, up to 800,000 children still work in the cocoa supply chain, and they are not hard to find. These two, barely in their teens, working up to 10 hours a day in their parents' farm, never been to school, and sometimes being hired out to neighbouring farms for labour. Jose Lopez is responsible for Nestlé's global operations. That's 468 factories in 86 countries. Why do you think it took the industry so long to admit the issue of child labour?
Probably finding solutions was not as easy, but it is not such process where nothing gets done and all of a sudden things get done.
But you seem to be having a difficulty accepting that the industry was late to dealing with this.
I have to say that we were late because a problem like this has to be dealt with. So any time that has been lost was lost. And that should not have happened.
We're on the move, but progress is slow. A lack of proper roads is high on the list of farmers' woes. We arrive in Zibuyakro. It's a small village with a big welcome for chocolate's royalty. Lopez is here to see how Nestlé's work to prevent child labour is working with the local community. And this is where the message gets taken deep into the rural community. No matter what the critics may say, if you can't get these people to accept the challenge of ending child labour, well, frankly, you're wasting your time.
The solutions that we see today, and I'm really very, very encouraged by what I see, have taken many institutions, NGOs, companies, traders, many people in the value chain have decided to step further and move, and we are moving.
A decisive move came in 2011 when Nestlé asked the Fair Labor Association to map out their supply chain. The conclusion: child labour is still a reality on cocoa farms, and Nestlé, because of its size, was well placed to make a difference. The company has pledged $120 million over 10 years for its sustainable cocoa plan. To stop child labour, create a sustainable flow of quality cocoa, and improve the lives of farmers. The fact is, child labour is a symptom of a much deeper malady: poverty.
Your average cocoa farmer is earning about 10% of the absolute poverty line. In simple English, it means that if you would increase a cocoa farmer's income tenfold, he would still be, in the definitions of the global society, absolutely poor.
The reasons are systemic. Across the Ivory Coast, cocoa is grown on small family farms, typically only a few hectares. Small parcels of land handed down through generations. Each son struggles like his father before him. When his father died 7 years ago, this boy inherited just 2 hectares. He was only 11 years old. Life is hard, he tells me. He tries to be courageous. He needs help. Unfortunately, the economics of cocoa, or Cocoa-nomics if you will, are firmly against him.
If you look at the cocoa price adjusted for inflation of about 1980, you'll see that cocoa price was close to $6,000 per ton. Now it's 22, 23, maybe 2,400. So it's less than half of what it was 30 years ago, and it's even less than what it was 50 years ago.
The relative value of cocoa in the chocolate bar has also been falling for the past 50 years.
In the mid-1970s, during the peak in cocoa prices, it was almost 50% of the value of a chocolate bar was the cost of cocoa. By 1980, this had fallen to 12%, and by 2012, it was just 6%. Today, so much of the value of a chocolate bar comes from research and development and marketing. And so for a farmer, they're finding that just by producing the raw beans, they are a very small part of the chain.
It's not surprising some farmers are giving up. Disillusioned, they're turning to other crops like rubber. Cocoa plantations are aging and in decline. The next generation are seeking what they believe is a better life in the capital city, Abidjan. This mass movement to the city is causing challenges for the country, how to handle such urbanization, and for the cocoa industry, which is losing its future farmers. All this at a time when chocolate itself is becoming more popular. No wonder companies like Nestlé decided it was time to act.
If things continue in the same way, the supply of cocoa will not be there. So that create this notion that in order to continue that activity and do it in a sustainable manner, we have to look beyond what we thought probably was our responsibility. We have to do something. It's a business case.
Escaping poverty is the key for a thriving cocoa industry and the eradication of child labour. When we return, how to put more money in the farmers' pockets. In the Ivory Coast, nearly 1 million cocoa farmers account for 1/5 of the country's economy. Collectively, they may be rich, individually very poor. The farmers are at the wrong end of the value chain, fighting to get more for their beans. Helping them is now a priority for a new government that emerged in 2012 after a decade of civil conflict.
two things have happened in the last 18 months or 2 years. One, the conflict is finished, we have a new government in place, and there appears to be relative stability compared to before. And the second is a reform of the cocoa sector, which at least in its first step is guaranteeing a more steady price for the farmers.
By law, farmers are now guaranteed a minimum price at the farm gate. It's about $1.50 per kilo of beans.
We should take care that the farmers have what they need to have a better life, but also that there will be some return for the industrial people who are investing in Côte d'Ivoire. It's not a charity here, it's a business. It must be, I think, a win-win game for all of us.
The fixing of a minimum price is, of course, an important step, but only if you've got enough beans to make it worthwhile. In Ivory Coast, there's a serious issue of low yields from old, diseased trees. This farmer says that once he'd paid for an operation for his son, he had nothing left to invest in his plantation. It's a classic catch-22. His trees are producing fewer cocoa beans, so he hasn't enough money to get finance to plant new trees or buy products. Sowing the seeds of science will be a crucial solution to this part of Cocoa-nomics. Here at Nestlé's Research and Development Centre in the capital Abidjan, there's a nursery of super saplings. In the plantations, genetics meets Cocoa-nomics.
The big difference is probably that they carry a much higher genetical potential in terms of yields. And maybe they're also more disease resistant.
By 2022, Nestlé plans to give away to farmers 12 million high-performance trees. New trees, higher yields, greater income. What Nestlé is doing here goes beyond simple generosity. It's making sure the company has enough cocoa in the future. If it was just the farmer and the chocolate maker, life would be simple. But there are the middlemen, the traders, the processors and exporters who all demand their cut. This is a buying station of the American food giant Cargill. Cargill buys 20% of all beans produced in the Ivory Coast, mostly from farmers' groups called cooperatives. Cargill exports the beans raw or grinds them into cocoa liquor, butter or powder, the very products used to make chocolate. So it's here that the bean becomes value added, and the farmer gets none of the extra value. Like chocolate makers, the processors need beans, so have a self-interest in the sustainability of growing cocoa. Augustin Ringo manages Cargill's supply of cocoa in the Ivory Coast.
We are really trying to focus our effort in increasing farmer revenues and increasing their livelihoods, let's say. And we are working too with certification, which is an important tool of our program, because by raising the standard of working, either in social part, environmental part, but to agriculture part, those farmers are getting rewarded for this extra work and increasing their revenue.
Certification. It's the means by which a cooperative's cocoa is given the stamp of approval from the likes of the Fair Trade Foundation, the Rainforest Alliance, or UTS. To get certified means growing your cocoa to strict standards, and that, of course, means no child labour. This cooperative warehouse is where the certification issue becomes very real. On the one side, the cocoa ordinaire, the normal supply chain. On the other side, the certified cocoa by UTS. Keeping the two separate goes to the heart of the credibility of certification. There's a real incentive for the farmers to grow certified cocoa. They get a higher market price and a bonus premium on top, up to $200 per tonne. But by buying certified cocoa, we can all join in Cocoa-nomics.
There is no one magic bullet. There's not one solution that will fit all of the problems. However, you do need vehicles for change. And I think that certification is probably the only decent vehicle we have at the moment.
It's thought that less than 20% of beans are currently sold as certified. But it's a rising trend, and several of the biggest chocolate manufacturers, Mars and Hershey included, have now committed to sourcing 100% certified by 2020. Nestle refuses to give the same commitment. Why will you not agree to 100% certification by 2020 as your competitors have?
Promises of what the world would be looking like in 2020 are loaded with a lot of unknowns. Of course, we take commitments. We have commitments that we present to the outside world, but they have to do with plans. And we are more interested to see how year after year we make progress. I have said, in the area of sustainability, it's not about walk the talk. It's about talking the walk.
These farmers are attending one of Cargill's field school academies to help them get certified. There's not a machete in sight. Higher income from certified beans is now being reinvested by local cooperatives into schools, healthcare and welfare. It is tomorrow's Cocoa-nomics in action, and the best hope for these communities to break out of the poverty trap. In a moment, it's all about education and a taste of chocolate. It is a supreme irony that the chocolate bar we take for granted at a price we don't mind paying is rarely seen in the Ivory Coast, even in the capital. There are chips and wafers and cookies and crisps of all types, but there's no chocolate, even though the stuff comes from here. Only 130 kilometers from the capital is the village of Cocoa-nomics. I talked to farmers about what's now a depressingly familiar tale of an impoverished lifestyle. But nothing brings home the inequity of Cocoa-nomics than farmers who've never seen, let alone tasted, the products that rely on their daily toil. These farmers have been growing beans for decades. They're about to get their first taste of chocolate. You have never tried chocolate?
Non. Vous n'avez jamais essayé de manger chocolat?
Mais où va trouver?
It turned out not one person in this group had tasted chocolate.
Ah.
C'est bon! Ça c'est bon! Ça c'est bon manger!
That is your cocoa! Jose Lopez, who runs the factory that makes the Kit Kat, is speeding through the capital of Abidjan. He's on his way to meet the First Lady. It's time for government and chocolate maker to come face to face. Dominique Ouattara is the wife of the president and determined that the government ends child labour. This is a delicate dance of Cocoa-nomics. The government needs Nestlé's investment, Nestlé needs the government's cocoa, and both have to find a solution like never before.
Je pense que le plus important sera de faire comprendre à nos frères paysans qu'ils ne doivent plus engager d'enfants dans leurs plantations. Nous avons fait une campagne de sensibilisation importante et je pense que nous aurons des résultats.
These children are 8 and 12 years old. Just saying that children of this age shouldn't be wielding machetes in the forest completely ignores the culture of the country. These children are helping out on the family farm. This sort of work goes on because children are slaves to necessity, slaves to poverty. If market forces constrain the price of cocoa, then education will be the main long-term weapon in the fight against child labour. Urfasi Aka has been working inside some of the poorest rural communities for 12 years.
Mon rêve, c'est d'avoir une communauté cacaoyère florissante où les droits des enfants sont respectés. donner l'opportunité à chaque enfant d'aller à l'école et avoir la capacité de faire un choix demain. Ou imiter ses parents à la cacoculture, ou faire autre chose, mais en apportant un appui à ses parents.
Education. Everyone is building schools, government, NGOs, and the chocolate companies. Nestle have built 23, and there are 17 more in the pipeline.
What do you think when you see what do you think?
What I think is that the effort is incredibly important, but also incredibly hard. And what I feel when I am here is I cannot think but the need to really focus on the long term. And we will not sacrifice the long term for short-term gains.
But you don't think putting more of your corporate money to building even more schools or building even more roads or just downright subsidizing farmers so that they can raise themselves out of the poverty trap? This company made 11 billion Swiss francs profit.
It will not work. The reality of the country is the reality that there is, which you have seen. You cannot just simply transform this production process by throwing money somewhere. We need to build capacity in those farmers to do a better job, to improve their yield, to protect their crops from diseases. We need to see prosperity entering into these villages. And to do that, it will take time. And the patience that will be needed, we have. And I believe those farmers also have the patience to prosper and progress step by step.
But to lift an entire society out of poverty will indeed take time. Decades of time. And yet there's an urgent short-term imperative to stop child labour.
It's hard to tell whether things are improving specifically for the children themselves because we don't really have any real statistics or any real data that says this is what it was 5 years ago and this is what it is now. The impression I have, though, is that the current steps being taken are actually more significant than what we have seen in the past.
The challenge now is to escalate the solutions we've seen in this programme, to reach more farmers, more communities, more villages, to make cocoa worth growing.
The whole idea is, again, that it all has to make sense. And making sense, we are a business, is that we are able to generate returns for our shareholders. And doing that, while at the same time benefiting society, is possible. I believe, and we in Nestle believe that very strongly.
Hope surely lies in our insatiable love of chocolate, whether it's a mid-morning snack, a romantic gift, or an Easter bunny. We, the consumers, can make choices that demand sustainable cocoa.
Everyone loves chocolate, and the world will continue to want chocolate, I think, even at higher prices perhaps. And so there's a demand. And where there's a demand, we can make the economy work.
Having been here, obviously, I've seen the grinding poverty that goes with growing cocoa. But I've also seen the very real change taking place. The parties having been driven to making those changes, often by enlightened self-interest, usually by public pressure, and always with a general realization that cocoa growing is becoming unsustainable. Cynics will argue that just like the colonial past or the rhetoric of anti-capitalism, it pays to keep the poor poor. But Jose Lopez makes an impassioned and convincing case for a chocolate industry finally embracing change. We must focus on that change and the momentum it is bringing. We can, we must, we will keep up the pressure to make sure everyone gets a fair deal. Nestle say every second 150 Kit Kats are eaten around the world, perhaps none as important as this one.